I move that you be the chair.
Gwen, is that all right with you?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with it.
Okay. All right, I'm the
Okay,
chair
By
by consensus.
consensus.
And no public comment.
Uh-huh.
Unless, Christina, you want to have a public comment?
Can I reserve till the end?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Approval of the agenda?
I don't have any.
I don't have an agenda.
Oh, it was sent out.
I said I didn't print anything out. I thought
Okay.
what she said in
Here,
her
I'll share it.
email.
There's not much on it. I'll share it with you.
Oh, well, you can keep it. She said she was bringing things to the meeting. That's what.
Well, that's what this is. This is this packet, but she didn't.
But she didn't include the agenda. She didn't give us copies, extra copies, no. Usually she does for people that
Yeah.
come in.
Okay, so that's the agenda, Gwen. There's nothing on it except
Okay.
just approval of the agenda. Does somebody move approval?
Yeah, I so moved.
Second.
Okay, new business, so discussion and action. And I thought it could be, is this being recorded?
Yes.
I thought it could be useful to give a little context for why I thought this was important to look at this policy about probation and parole searches.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many things that that made me think this is important. The most immediate thing was that there are complaints in the African American community that one of the first things they're asked when, in a minor traffic stop is whether they're on probation and parole. Number one, that's one thing. The second thing is that the report of the the outside report, the CPE,
Yeah.
is it called? Reporting that African Americans are searched 4 times more than whites.
Right.
Now, there are 3 ways in which a motorist reasons for which a motorist can be searched. You probably know this information, but some of it was new to me. One is consent.
Right.
The other is suspicion of criminal activity. There's articulable facts that lead the officer to believe that there are weapons or something in the car. And the third is what's called a 4th waiver, which means if you find out that somebody's on parole or probation, you can search their car without consent,
Right.
or their person, or their house. Right? And so it struck me that one very possible reason, trying to get to the bottom of these disparities in stops and searches and arrests and so forth, one of the obvious reasons for the disparate number of searches for people of color, especially blacks, is that they're asked this parole and probation question, which strikes me as a not obvious, but a very clear example of racial profiling, and which is illegal and discriminatory. So it seems to me that we need to review this policy, especially in light of the PRC report that, Terry, you were instrumental in putting together way back in 2000, and Gwen too, maybe you were on the commission at that time.
Back in when? 17?
17.
Yeah, we were on the committee subcommittee
Yeah.
together. And
So in 2017, the city council, well, not 2017, 1 year ago, actually, it took them a while, but 1 year ago in April of 2018, the city council accepted and acknowledged the report from the PRC,
Right.
including review and update Berkeley Police Department policy regarding inquiries to parole and probation status. The city manager and Berkeley Police Department should review existing policies surrounding asking the community members whether they are on probation or parole. That was agreed to on consent in the city council unanimously, and nothing was ever done about reviewing that policy.
The whole issue with the rest of the fair and impartial report. I mean, this is one segment of it.
right,
They haven't done anything else.
Right, but
That
here
was
is
what
a-
my whole thing
right.
last meeting was, yeah.
right, but here is something I'd like to begin to, push, because I think it's really critical. It erodes trust and legitimacy in the community of the police, and, so there was that. That's the
You're
first
reading
of
from
these
the
handouts,
report
page
or
two.
from the- yeah.
Page two of the first, after this, the first thing you have is that proposal from me.
Yeah, let's see if I've got this in, this is the, oh yeah, I got this backward.
Well, they didn't put it in the right
There
order.
we go. So,
So-
this is on the, what's the heading on that you're reading from?
I wish they put
I saw it, the
it,
staff.
they didn't put it in the right order, so, let me see. The heading on it is, it looks like this,
Okay,
Let's see. What is it?
from Councilmember Harrison, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council.
Okay, so it must be under the, is it under the advised agenda?
what's this thing here,
It's-
revised
The
agenda
supplemental?
material?
This one?
Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, that's not the exact
Don't
one.
you have the,
Yeah, but that's not the exact one, but it's good enough, the supplemental thing.
isn't this the report you're reading from though?
The second page?
Yeah, April 24th, 2018, staff report. Or Councilmember Harrison.
This isn't exactly.
What are you reading from? Then we'll know where to look, because.
Well, they don't apparently have the exact one, but I sent them to, this is what I'm reading from.
What
That's
date?
not
It's
this
a
memo
memo
right
from-
here? Isn't that this memo? If you look at page one there?
Yeah, but it's not exactly the same, because this happens at the bottom of page two.
Hmm. Well, maybe.
Oh, okay, so it's three. On this one, you have the supplemental
Yeah,
3, review and update Berkeley Police Department policy. You see it on page
Mm-hmm.
here.
page,
The back of the
Oh,
second.
Yes, it's
Oh,
on the
yeah.
back here.
Okay, thank you.
number 3 on
And
Number
whatever.
3.
And it's under April 24th,
And
2018.
that was part of what the city council accepted and
Right, right.
recommended, and so that's one thing. The other thing is that this recommendation was actually included in the chief's report when he responded a few weeks ago.
Mhm.
He included all these recommendations in an appendix,
Right,
and this was one of those.
yeah, but basically what he did is sort of regurgitated all of the recommendations, but didn't really set a
Yes, it was,
time frame or
Yes.
moving forward with it or what, at least he acknowledged it,
he acknowledged it.
right?
The other thing that I have to say about it is that when this came up very briefly at the last meeting that I was at the PRC meeting, and somehow it came up, and the chief and I went back and forth a little bit. It was after you had set the context for
Mhm.
critiquing the report, and then I
Right.
had a few things to say, and then he said that the reason for the disparate searches, I thought this was very informative,
Mhm.
enlightening. The reason for the disparate searches is that there's disparities in the society, which is sort of a turn on
Oh,
what I was
right,
saying.
right.
But it implied that the reason is that blacks and brown people are more likely to be on probation and parole, and therefore we ask them.
That's an assumption.
That is racial
It's an assu- Well,
profiling.
that's
That's an
too.
assumption.
And I
It's an
didn't hear him
assumption.
say that. If I had heard him, I would
No,
have said
he
something.
didn't.
I didn't hear him
He said
say
that the
that.
reason for it is that the disparities in society and incarceration, and so.
I didn't hear any of that, and I was sitting there, so I'm a little taken aback by it.
Well, in any case,
Mhm.
so now the legal basis for these searches, there was no established legal basis for these so-called fourth waiver searches until 2006. and I think you do have Sampson versus California in your packet. That's the decision looks like this. That's the decision in 2006.
Mhm.
Sampson versus California, 2006, decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a case that came out of California in which a man on probation or parole, I forget which, was searched and contested it. And the different courts there before that had waffled on whether the police have a right to do that. The previous court decision about such things said only parole officers have the right to search a parolee, not police officers. This was the first one that established, once in parole, that police officers have the right, once they know someone's on probation or parole, to search them.
Is there effective language in this particular thing that really gets to the crux of it, or do you?
Well,
It should be in there because it was.
yes, there is.
It was, delivered, the opinion was delivered by Thomas.
Yes, and I'll tell you where it is. Page 5, I hope that you have the same,
Page 5.
I hope that you have the same,
I don't have any
Exactly.
page numbers, but I guess that would be page, this is page
well,
1.
it's just before part 4. You
Just
see
before,
Roman numeral 4.
4? Okay, just before
When
4.
you see Roman numeral.
Yeah, I was just looking through the other, I saw it.
8, 5,
Okay,
6.
so they say,
Is it section 856?
yes, it's 856, section 856.
Okay.
So the argument is that there is no merit to the argument that the law gives a blanket grant of discretion untethered by any procedural safeguards, says Thomas. Because the law in California already prohibits, quote, arbitrary, capricious, and harassing searches. So therefore, the Supreme Thomas and his allies decided that there's a protection against discriminatory searches, and therefore we're going to give police discretion. However, Stevens, Souter, and Breyer dissented vehemently, saying that this would constitute an entirely suspicionless search, unsupported by any special need. And you can see the dissent. Well, you can read this in your own time, but the dissent is included here as well.
Okay.
Oh, that's the dissent, starting on, Roman numeral 4 starts the dissent,
Right,
okay?
yeah.
And so, but I just thought it was worthwhile pointing out that until 2006, this was not established in law at all. And that, okay, then we have the REPA report, the Racial Identification and Profiling Act. Let's see if I can find where it is in the things that you've got. They mandated that there be a racial identification and profiling board that issues an annual report. And I'm not sure that that's included in this packet.
Well, you know, the REPA was the 1916 or 2016 law or something that did.
Yes.
Maybe it's, this thing that says traffic stops.
No, it's not.
It looks like
No,
it's
it's not. It looks like that. I have it, I don't know why it wasn't included. I sent it out to be included. It looks like this. It's the annual report,
Oh.
just issued this year, 2019. And the reason.
Is that issued by the state or by somebody?
Yeah, by the state. It's a board put together by the state,
Yeah,
and this is their annual report.
And you sent that to,
And I sent, there's an appendix B, compiled best practice recommendations.
did you send it to Kathy for it to be,
For
us?
Yep.
then, Well, do you want
It's
you want
not-
some copies to be made? Because we can,
It's
they're
not
right
that
here.
critical, there's only one thing I can read this to you, it's just
It's
racial.
just good to have the background for all of us.
Yes, definitely.
So, makes it more effective if we all agree.
Do you want
on
me to
the
get
same
copies
page.
of it?
We could get her to make copies. If you put it in there and they didn't, they're sitting right there, we can have it done.
Okay, well, the only thing is that I thought was interesting, they don't specifically say anything about the parole and probation and questioning, but what I thought was interesting was that they do quote what racial or identity profiling is in the California Penal Code, how it's defined.
mhm,
Is defined as a consideration of or reliance on to any degree actual or perceived race, color, ethnicity, et cetera, in deciding which persons to subject to a stop or in deciding upon the scope or substance of law enforcement activities following a stop, except that an officer may consider to rely on characteristics listed in a specific suspect description. The activities include but are not limited to traffic or pedestrian stops or actions during a stop, such as asking questions, frisks, etc. of a person based on their racial profile.
mhm.
And so we have, for some reason, it has not been included in the data to be collected by the department,
Right.
whether this question was asked, because I would really like to see the correlation between asking this question and doing the subsequent search correlated with racial identity.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know that, you know, they're only collecting so much data. That was kind of one
Well, I
of
thought that
my
would be.
issues before, because they told us they were gonna be collecting data that would comply with REPA, and they're not. Now they say they're only collecting a portion
Well,
of
but
the
REPA
data.
doesn't require this particular item.
They don't,
It's been an oversight, I think.
okay.
The question,
Yeah.
the parole question and the subsequent searches. So, so there are really two issues here. One is the question itself. There are two related issues. One is the question itself. When you stop somebody, should you be allowed, a police officer, absent any suspicion, should you be allowed to ask, are you on parole or probation? That's one issue,
Mhm.
which is a signal of disrespect and profiling of a sort. The second issue is, once you know that, should you be allowed to search the,
Mhm.
let's say vehicle, let's say it's a traffic stop?
Mhm.
Because the Oakland Commission, the Oakland Police Commission has acted on each of these two things. The first is, you should not immediately ask a motorist, any motorist, if they're on probation or parole. If you know that they are, just from prior knowledge, you can only search their vehicle if they were on parole or probation for a violent offense,
Mhm.
or there are articulable facts to suggest to you that there is criminal activity going on.
Mhm.
But absent those two things, even if you know they're on probation or parole, you don't have a blanket
Mhm.
search allowance.
Right, right.
Well, I don't think they should ask you anyway if you're on probation or parole. When you present them with your identification, whether it's your license,
Right.
your ID or whatever, they can look in the database.
Right.
So there's no reason other than to insult the people of color. That's
Right.
the only reason.
Right.
There's no other reason,
Or
because they're
they're-
not doing it to anyone else.
Yeah.
And
So
this
that's
thing,
the bottom line.
this thing about traffic stops that you have in your,
Mhm.
this is the Attorney General sorry. This is the Alameda County District Attorney.
Mhm.
And on page 4 of that,
Traffic stops?
on the page 4 of the traffic stops handout, at the top,
Mhm.
it tells you how a traffic stop is to be engaged in, practiced. And what you're to do is identify, and this is what happens to me when I'm stopped.
Right.
Satisfactory proof of the driver's identity, driver's license, registration, proof of insurance,
And so it's
DMV
required.
check, and maybe inspect the VIN of the vehicle. There's nothing here about asking parole and probation. The DMV check, Gwen, to my knowledge, does not tell the officer, in fact, the chief confirmed this the other day, the other meeting. It doesn't say whether somebody has criminal offenses on their record or you have to call in specifically to the dispatcher and ask
Right,
them.
and that's what they do.
That's what they do.
That's the normal
Right.
procedure.
But I would
Berkeley.
argue that they shouldn't do that.
Well, they do that.
I know, I'm just
So-
saying, I'm proposing new
Mhm.
policies.
So this is from the California Attorney General, traffic stops, or this is
No,
from
the
state?
Alameda County,
Huh?
Alameda County,
Oh, Alameda County,
District Attorney.
County DA, okay. Okay.
And it's not that, the Alameda County District Attorney, it's not that he's saying this question, but this is the normal way you go about a traffic stop.
Right.
And there's nothing in general order, and you have the general order, and you just got the general order T3, which is the Berkeley Police Department discussion of how you are to conduct a traffic stop. And if you look at number 14 on that, the one that's the Berkeley Police Department General Order T3, they just gave it to us this
This
morning.
one?
No, it looks like this.
It's got purpose.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's Oakland, that one they had.
There's so many packets.
I know. So number 14 on this
Jeez.
simply says,
Mhm.
here, you can have this one.
Thank you.
Mhm.
14.
Employees shall conduct themselves in a professional and courteous manner, request the detainee's identification, and any other document or information necessary to accomplish the enforcement action, which is a traffic enforcement action,
Mhm.
Right.
right? Nothing mentioned here at all about finding out whether they're on probation or parole.
Well, they
service
grandfathered in under any other document or information, right?
necessary to accomplish the law enforcement action, which is a traffic stop.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
right. So,
That's probably where they would say we have the word, yeah.
probably, because
Right,
that
I mean, that's
opens.
not explicit, but it's
Right.
grandfathered in a big hunk of other information.
But
So-
I would propose that I'll open the floor to you two now, because I've talked enough, but it seems to me that it would be reasonable, given all these documents, and given the city council and REPA and the coalition on, what's the name of the commission that we commissioned, the report, CPE? You know what I'm talking about?
Mhm.
That given this context, we propose that the police department allow fourth waiver searches only if an officer knows beforehand about parole and probation. They should not ask the question, and they should not check the records unless there's reason to suspect that there's criminal activity. And number 2, that they only allow a search of the vehicle if the parole or probation was for a violent offense. That to me would be a reasonable proposition, and it's consistent with the Oakland one.
Mhm.
But I don't know how you want to proceed.
Well, it seems like to me, at least, Gwen, do you wanna?
So you can go ahead and then I'll
Seems like to me it would be reasonable to, your two questions are reasonable, should they be allowed to ask the question, or should they be allowed to search, right? I mean, that's kind of what it comes down to.
Right, or under what conditions should they validate?
And, yeah, but there would be sort of
Yeah.
subsections under that.
Right.
And it seems to me that we should just get our own thoughts together specifically on how that would come down,
Mm-hmm.
what we thought was relevant,
Mm-hmm.
and, propose an amendment to the policy.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
then, take it back to the commission and see, we have the chief, we need to run it by the chief and see what they say.
I actually think this is one that Chief might not be overly concerned about, because he is a big proponent of what's called procedural justice. And respect is one of those things, and they're losing legitimacy in the community by asking this question.
Yeah, but I think if the chief, during his morning briefings with his staff, lieutenants on down, if he sets the tone as to stop asking this question, it would have been done. This has been going on. This is not something new because you just got here.
No, I know.
That, now you're gonna make everything just
Right.
great and hunky-dory. This has been going on.
Oh, I know,
And
it's been
so
going on.
The
I'm
bottom
sure it
line,
does.
I believe it comes from the top. If you set a tone, I was a human resource manager, you set the tone, then the staff knows what to follow. If you're not setting the tone, then they're out here saying and doing whatever they
Right,
want.
so obviously, the tone has not been set.
It hasn't been set.
And we have oversight. We can propose a policy that would go beyond, that would require a tone,
Well, that's a possibility, but if you wanna get around something, you can get around it. I mean.
I think if we explicitly say, upon a stop,
Mhm.
asking
Because people
whether
have been
somebody's
stopped
on-
that are not on probation or parole. They have
Right.
been stopped,
Oh, of course. Yeah.
and I know them personally. So this is not something that just came up a year ago, 2 years ago. This is ongoing. So it needs to be resolved. And I think the way Oakland has proceeded, Berkeley should proceed. And it shouldn't take
Where's
that long.
it-
So
where's
do you think we're
covering
gonna
on?
put a packet, a proposal together that includes these two elements, the asking of the question, and then under what conditions would you be allowed to search? Like, you can't ask the
Exactly.
question, you cannot ask the
You
question.
should not ask it.
And-
If you're not asking it of everyone else in this city who pay taxes,
Yeah.
or don't pay taxes, then you shouldn't ask it of a certain segment of the population, because that's just total racial profiling.
That definition of profiling.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what it is.
And I think in our proposal, we could, quote REPA, or actually, this is the California Penal Code.
Right.
Yeah, my thinking is we should put something in the policy that says that question isn't appropriate upon a traffic stop. Now, past that, then it goes to what's the next step. It's like if they run the ID and come up and the person's on parole or probation, then I think we need to address that.
Then does that
Well,
say in the
because-
policy, is it in their policy where they can search since Tom, what's his name, Thomas?
Oh, the
Thomas-
Sampson case.
Yeah, the Sampson case. See, if you're on probation, what are your conditions? I don't know what your conditions are. Your conditions might be,
You waive your right.
you're waiving your rights, number one, and number two, you could be on some type of search clause. But who should be
waive-
able to do that? Is that something that we want the city of Berkeley doing to people that's coming in the city or whatever, searching everybody? Do we want that?
No,
What do we want?
probation and parolee, people on probation and parolees waive their Fourth Amendment right when they, the probationer and the parolee are slightly
Right.
different, but when the
Right.
parolee gets out of prison, they waive their right to avoid a search, okay? But that doesn't mean,
While they're on parole,
yeah, but what I'm saying is that doesn't mean we can't restrict it.
yes.
Yeah, Well, I think we just sort of come up with something we think is reasonable in terms of how they would proceed on that situation. So, cause it's not just asking the question, it's like, what if they find out on their search that they're on probation or parole, then what? Because to me, they, you know, if it is, like you're talking about the violent situation versus somebody was, you know, got on probation because they were smoking marijuana or something like that, or for some reason, it's a different
Which is
kind of
now
question.
legal.
Yeah, it's not legal, but it's, you know, whatever would be what I would call a minor offense. Then, I think then in certain circumstances, my feel is they should be able to search, and in other ones they wouldn't.
Right, but I believe, what my preference would be, and we can arrive at this by consensus or not, I mean, you know, I'm willing to compromise on this. I think that they should not be allowed to ask the question, and they should not be allowed to contact the dispatcher to find out unless they have some suspicion there's criminal activity going on. Because this is a traffic stop.
Mm-hmm.
And to avoid the profiling situation, they need, I think it would be best. Because it's not enough to just say you can't ask the question. If they're then allowed to, every time they encounter an African-American motorist, go and ask the dispatcher and then search.
But they use the stop as a reason to
I know, but they
be able
wouldn't, they
to.
wouldn't be allowed to do that if they weren't allowed to ask that question. I'm not saying it's gonna solve all problems and they can get around it for sure.
Do you know that when they run the ID online, they wouldn't get that information, they have to call the dispatcher to get it?
I thought when they,
I mean, don't they
No,
run it
can't-
online?
They can't get it by going on the DMV site.
no, not DMV, but they have another database that shows that information.
When they run the ID, it wouldn't show if they're, yeah.
I don't know about that. I don't know, but I would say my preference would be that they can't do either. Check it out online or through the dispatcher unless they have some reasonable suspicion that there's criminal activity and I wouldn't confine it to motorists and their traffic stops, pedestrians too. I mean, they get stopped and searched, ask that question too. So I would say whenever there is a stop for a traffic offense or a pedestrian situation, that question cannot be asked unless there's some suspicion. And even if they are on parole or probation, consistent with the Oakland policy now, they should only be allowed to search it if it was for a violent offense. Otherwise that, because the current policy opens the door for them to stop willy-nilly,
And that's what they
just
do.
so they can
That's
search.
exactly what they're doing. What
And
they've
unless
been
we
doing.
have these policies,
Yeah.
the stops will continue.
Mhm.
It is a stop and frisk situation, basically.
How does Oakland know, understand if it's a violent offense or not? How do they have a record of that?
I guess there's
Yeah,
a
I do.
signal in the record, but, yeah,
Hmm.
there must be I don't know for sure, but there must be a designation on the record, you know, child abuse, robbery, something.
Yeah, they have a certain database, and I don't know what it's called, but you're able to pull up people who, it's like Megan's Law, you can pull people up that's next door to you that's a sex offender.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I mean, it's the same, it's a database, but I don't know the name of it. But they can pull up things that you've done but I don't.
yeah, but the point is, we should disallow that.
Of course,
Yeah,
of course.
so that's what I'm saying, so I don't know
Mhm.
whether we want to write this up as a committee, or whether somebody should draft it, and then, or whether we need to do more research, or how do you wanna proceed?
Well, the only thing I would be interested in is, on the violent offense, something to make, that makes sense to me. But then the question becomes, well, how do they find that out?
Mhm.
I mean, is it a distinction that they can't find out anyway, or that it's gonna be easy to find out?
Why don't we ask the chief?
Yeah, we've got
We
I'm
need
making
to
a
ask
list here.
him.
Yeah, it's like, how do they get their information? right?
Because it's a database, I just don't know the name of it. It's a database that can hook up to across the United States. I don't know if they're going through the Department of Justice. It's something that they can tell if you're here and you did something somewhere else, they can tell that. So it has to be a large database. I just
Well,
don't
yeah,
know the
if you're
name of it.
thinking that the dispatchers could access it, I mean, Berkeley's not gonna have those records, right? So they
Apparently, there
must
are
get
two
it.
types of dispatchers. One is the one that sends people out on the, particular
Yeah.
patrol. The dispatcher that I'm talking about, and I only know this from a few incidents, but the dispatcher I'm talking about is a specific person you call in the department who will tell you about the criminal record.
Yeah.
Right.
So they
So
must
that-
get to the
they-
database.
they have that
Maybe they're looking
database
at that
access.
database.
Right.
But in
Yeah.
any case, I bet that database includes whether it's for a nonviolent or
Of
violent
course it
crime.
would.
So,
Mm-hmm.
that's a detail we'd have to iron out, but the policy itself, the Oakland policy, doesn't specify how that would be determined, but.
Where's that covered in the Oakland? Do you have that marked on the Oakland policy? I guess this is it,
This
item
is
9A.
it, 9A.
Yeah. Do you have that?
Here it is, nonviolent offenses are defined as offenses in which violence or use of a weapon is not a factor.
Mm-hmm.
Examples include simple possession of controlled substances or property crimes such as petty theft.
Mm-hmm.
Is it A?
Yeah. And a violent offense involves the use of force, well, you can read it.
Mm-hmm.
So they specify.
So they define it, and so they say, let me see how this applies though.
We could follow their lead here, make our lives easier. They look like they covered all bases here.
Yeah, B2 is exactly what I was talking about, procedural justice considerations. Because I
What
know
is
the
it?
chief,
B2?
B2, the chief is on board with the procedural justice policy. And so they even include that here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd have to read this to see if we ought to go along totally with the Oakland policy. but
Yeah,
I
'cause
think
it looks like
most
they've
of-
covered.
Looks
they
like
did
they've
their
got it
homework
covered. I'd
real
have
well.
to understand the overall.
You know, the
concept.
only thing that I don't prefer about their policy is at the bottom of B3, bottom of page 2.
Okay.
It says basically only that they shouldn't immediately ask the question.
B3?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
second part of that paragraph. Or rather, the whole paragraph. They shouldn't ask it at the beginning of an interaction. To that end, officer shall not immediately inquire. Any subsequent inquiries about probation, parole, etc. shall be framed in a respectful manner. I just think they shouldn't be allowed. Just because you don't ask it the first thing you do, this would allow it in the middle of your interaction, not immediately.
Well, where do they stipulate what they, what's the criteria for being able to ask?
It doesn't say.
Okay.
It only, see, I would prefer to disallow it altogether, and then you can search if there's,
So they haven't disallowed it, essentially, is what B3
they
is
haven't
saying.
disallowed it altogether, they've
They
disallowed it
allowed
at the
it in
beginning
the
of an
initial
interaction.
question.
What they
right?
do require, however, is that if the person is on supervised release, they cannot search the vehicle unless it was for a violent offense.
Where's that at? Full
C2,
search, cursory search.
C2.
Okay, but if you read further, it's saying to that end, officers shall not immediately inquire whether an individual is unsupervised.
That just means immediately, if you read.
It means there is an immediate threat, unless there's a threat to the officer.
Right, but that just means you can't ask the first thing.
Right.
You can ask.
And then you can ask, and it has to be in a
You can ask
respectful
later.
manner.
Yeah, but,
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's
bogus.
a baloney.
That's
That's why I say
baloney.
they didn't
That's
actually
baloney.
prohibit it.
That's baloney,
Yeah.
because that's the problem with procedural justice.
Yeah.
I'm a
Right.
critic of that literature,
Mhm.
because I'm sorry, if they ask you in search, but you call them sir and ma'am, that doesn't do the trick,
Mhm, mhm.
you know? People want respect in substance, not just
Right.
in word.
Yeah, that,
So I would,
we shouldn't
I
even
would
put that
go
in, there. that
further.
should be a straight no.
I would go further than that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But some of this stuff is really useful in
Mhm.
terms of the,
Well, I mean, I would definitely support going in the direction we're talking about. I'd have to read Oakland and understand it in context. You know, the devil's in the detail, and one sentence can make a difference, just like
Right.
that one did.
just like that one, yeah.
Right. So we thought they had prohibited it, and they
And
haven't.
they hadn't.
Right, right.
Just a little trick of the hand there.
The main
Yeah,
thing they
right.
do is, the main thing they do is restrict the search.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
Well, you know, were there, any subsequent inquiries about probation and parole sentence that we just read on B3? We could caveat that even more. In other
Right.
words, we could say, unless it
There's
is
a-
a violent offense, or some, whatever we would want to put in
Well,
there.
the caveat I would put there is that you don't ask at all unless there are articulable facts to suggest there's criminal activity going on.
Mhm.
Like if you see a gun on the, but then C3 tells you for nonviolent offenses, officers shall not C3, which is on the last
Mhm.
page,
Which
one?
officers,
Oh, what?
C3,
Which section?
The left
C3.
and back.
3 on the back?
Officers shall not search that individual who's on release for nonviolent offenses unless there are articulable facts that demonstrate the individual is connected in some way to criminal activity. So that's the section that says, if you find out they're on supervised release, and it's for a nonviolent offense, you cannot search unless there are facts to demonstrate illegal activity is going, criminal activity. As a first stab at this, I don't know that we need to make the proposal so lengthy.
Mhm.
I think maybe we could, propose it and then have, I don't know, appendices or something that include all this information.
Yeah, my thinking is we ought to, you know, do our own soul searching, look over Oakland and make sure that we're, you know, some of their wording could help if we're
Right.
buying into it, right?
Mhm.
Right,
And then we would then figure out kind of where we think it would belong in the current Berkeley policy. And
insert it,
amend it accordingly and then send it back to the commission.
insert it into the,
The
I don't know where it would
general-
be, because the T3 is only about traffic stops.
Yeah,
I'd
this
like it to
wouldn't
be.
fit in unless we,
Oh, would it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we need to just do something standalone then. I don't know, I mean, if this isn't traffic, oh, this is
That's
traffic.
just traffic, which is what the T.
So they don't cover pedestrians or anything?
That's just traffic stops, I
Uh,
believe, isn't
it's
it?
just traffic, that's what it says.
I don't know. what that
Traffic
means.
enforcement, yeah.
It's about, vehicles.
Yeah, parking and that type of stuff. Speed and,
Now I've lost mine, did I give it to you?
Oh, did you give me
The
this one?
T3? No, that's Oakland.
T3?
Yeah, that's it, yeah, thanks.
Can I request a copy?
Sure.
Okay.
So this is traffic law enforcement, yeah, this doesn't cover pedestrians.
Hmm.
Didn't this came in the packet, didn't it, you guys?
I didn't
what,
get it.
which one?
Wasn't the traffic, wasn't the T3 in your
Yeah,
packet?
it was in our packet.
Well, why wasn't it in her packet?
Yeah, it's not complete.
It's
Oh,
probably
wait, here it
because
is.
she
I'm
does-
sorry.
Okay.
Thank
That's
you, dear,
it.
thank you.
All right.
Is there public comment, or do you wait for?
Well,
motion response?
I'm not sure we're quite ready,
Okay.
but,
Thank you.
Well, I think we're on
So,
the right
do you-
track, I think
Yeah.
so.
Would you like to have another meeting in which we, all three of us, each of us goes individually through the Oakland policy and makes alterations to it?
I think that would be a good idea. What do you think,
Terry?
Yeah, I would like to understand more in Oakland, because I
Yeah.
think we could,
Me
you know,
too.
we don't have to reinvent the wheel. If
That's
it's
what I'm
something
saying, we don't need
believe
to,
in,
yeah, I agree
but
with
we
you.
could amend it according to what we think
Right.
should be done.
What is useful
But I
for,
think that we should use our own, I mean, I think we should go by that.
and use what
And
works
use-
for Berkeley.
Yes, and use our own words, because
Mhm.
I don't wanna just be mimicking,
No,
Okay.
I agree with you.
you know, so we can get
100%.
ideas from it, but use
Yeah.
our own.
No, I agree, yeah.
So,
Yeah, I
so
was
shall we
looking-
each go through the, independently at home, the Oakland policy,
Yeah,
which
I'm
we
gonna
have,
look it over, yeah,
and
and then we
just-
could just,
make suggestions?
yeah, and then we bring it back for the next meeting.
Yeah,
And so when do you wanna have another meeting?
oh boy, I should have brought my calendar,
Oh, yeah,
but anyway,
oh.
what are your limitations?
My limitations are, I really like mornings, but this works as long as I'm out by
3:30?
3:30.
Is only what?
She has to be out by 3:30 in terms of the next meeting.
Cause I like it from 11 to 3:30. Anything you know, works for me.
But you wanted to do the afternoon, didn't you?
I
Can
can
you go
do in
swimming?
between 11 and 3:30, it's just only this particular time.
Okay.
Oh, okay,
We could do 11 to 12:30 some other time.
Yeah,
Does that work for you?
yeah, that'll work for me.
And what days work for you? I didn't bring my calendar, but I can remember.
All days. I just have to pick up my granddaughter, that's why I need to be out of here at
Okay.
a certain time,
How,
cause she's in school.
How long will it take us to, you need a week to do this assignment?
Yeah, because we're meeting on Wednesday for all this other stuff.
Oh my
You know?
God.
Oh, yeah.
And
The
you saw how
fact is
thick
like-
that is, and so we gotta read that, but I'll be reading this also, I mean,
Okay, so next week,
or do you wanna do?
how about an 11 o'clock meeting on,
Or you wanna do the week after, I don't know. What do you think?
next week's okay with me. I mean, I'll read
Monday?
stuff by then, but I don't know about Monday. Let's see.
Tuesday?
Okay, so next week is the week of the 17th. So,
Yeah, my best days would be, Tuesday, well, let me think about that. Tuesday or Thursday, that would be my best days.
Tuesday or Thursday at 11?
Yeah, I could do 11.
okay.
I can
Tuesday
also
or-
do Thursday. What do you prefer?
You say
when?
Tuesday or Thursday,
Do you care?
whichever one?
Okay.
You wanna do a Thursday, is that what you said, or what did we?
He said
say?
Tuesday or Thursday.
Tuesday or Thursday, I could do.
Let's do a Thursday.
Tuesday's better for
Oh,
you?
Tuesday's
All
better
right,
for
let's
you?
do it
Francine.
Tuesday.
Well, you know what I normally do on Tuesdays?
What?
I usually, every Tuesday, I have lunch in San Francisco with my girlfriend
Oh,
since
you
I
can't bring
retired.
that.
Oh,
No, it's okay, I can
Oh, on
always stay.
Tuesday? Oh, okay.
I just, that's
Francine
something
has
I've been
music
doing
on
for
Thursday.
almost 10 years since I
oh,
retired.
wow.
But
Good
that's
for
not a
you.
big deal, you know, I can rearrange it,
Oh,
because we wanna take care of
okay.
this.
all right.
And I know I have another, committee meeting
I
this
think Thursday.
next-
Oh, Tuesday. Okay, Tuesday's all right for me, I think, but I don't have my calendar. You guys
If
put
it's
it
not
on.
all right, if Thursdays work, then
Okay.
you'll let us know.
So Tuesday
So
or
we'll
Thursday,
put
but tentatively Tuesday, and if I have to change.
And you said at 11, yeah, if you have to
11 to
change.
12:30.
Yeah, that'll work.
You
Tuesday?
can, Tuesday.
Huh?
Yes.
Yep. Unless otherwise
Tuesday, the
notified.
18th,
Mhm.
right?
Yes,
At 11.
at 11. 11 o'clock.
11 to 12:30.
We're, as you can see, concise here. We
Same
don't,
place.
we'll take an hour and be finished.
Right.
I just don't know, for the purpose of proposing this in front of the commission and later, you know, the chief and city council and so forth, whether it's better to have a succinct, you know, one or two paragraph thing, or whether it should consist of the whole, you know, what's a nonviolent offense, all the stuff that's in the Berkeley one.
Can you do both?
What do you mean, The Berkeley one.
I mean, the Oakland
The
one,
Oakland
yeah.
one.
Well, I don't know, I think we ought to take something back that would be in context.
Okay,
It wouldn't, you know, it would have to give it some context.
okay.
It doesn't have to be 10 pages long or
No,
something,
but I could provide a 1 or 2 page context and therefore make a 1 or 2 paragraph proposal
Mhm.
and then have an appendix to it, which would include what's the definition of a nonviolent offense, those details.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mhm.
How's that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would work because.
I'd
you
like to know
we're-
how Oakland put theirs through so quickly. That's what I'd like to know.
Well, I think they've been at it for a while.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, they have?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think
okay.
they've
Yeah.
been going at it for a while.
So, okay.
I mean, that would work for me.
Are you in a hurry?
Oh, well, I was just wondering if I should speak.
Yeah,
Sit
yeah,
down.
as soon as,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
That's
It
okay,
sounded like she was coming
You
to a
so
break.
anxious.
I'll let you know.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Okay.
So next Tuesday or Thursday, but probably Tuesday at 11 o'clock,
Right,
we'll meet and we'll all three have gone through the Oakland thing.
Right.
And see, okay, we don't like this, we like that.
right, okay.
And, I might even make a stab at having a 1-page context and, you know, something.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so,
Okay.
okay, I think
I think
we're
this is great.
ready for public comment.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm for the restaurant. All right. So, thank you, Christine Schwartz. I have the honor of speaking to you. I don't want you to crack your necks.
That's all right.
So while you were going through all of this, I had some thoughts going through my mind. First of all, my experience, and I don't know whether this is relevant or not, but my experience when calling Oakland for Oakland PD for
Mhm.
anything has been very bad. Like, you can't even get through on the regular phone line. That's how bad it is. So I'm really happy that, you know, we can call Berkeley PD and get some service immediately. Secondly, oh yeah, so I thought I heard maybe 2 meetings ago at the PRC that police, when they're making the stops, that they do not have access to all of the database information.
Unless they call in.
Unless they call in.
Mhm.
So that there is certain databases, and that would be the reason why they ask the question, so that they could just give them, the person that they've stopped, the opportunity to tell them before having to ask them. And my concern there is what's happened to Oakland PD officers on stops. How they've been, I don't know if you remember the 4 officers who got shot on the spot, and then there was a trend of those. You know, sort of to like beat that situation. And I'm not saying that because I totally understand what you're saying, and I think what I heard you say was that only probation officers are allowed to ask these questions?
No.
Oh, no, that's not, okay.
No.
All right.
Samson
So-
versus California gives the right to any probation, parole, or peace officer.
Or peace, okay,
Mhm.
so they are.
Yeah.
But you're saying your wish would be that only the probation officers would be able to, or?
Well, yeah, we don't deal with.
You don't deal with that,
We
okay.
don't deal with that since we're the police review commission, but we would limit, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that would be
Basically
my,
going back to before 2006, when they weren't unilaterally allowed to do it.
oh, okay.
Mhm.
And I would have to go through the Oakland PD general orders and see myself. I haven't had the chance because this is the first time I've seen the T3. So let's see.
The
Yeah, that
T3 is the Berkeley general order, you know.
Oh, the Berkeley,
Yeah.
okay. All right, thank you. So that was all really that my thoughts were on this. I've been really busy, so it's hard to me to read all of this stuff before meetings, and I'm busy doing editing and stuff. So if you had any responses on those concerns, I was just trying to see the whole picture, so to speak. Thank
I
you.
have one question of clarification on what you said about the 4 people that were shot,
The
4
4
officers that were
officers.
shot. You're
Oakland
talking about
PD.
6 or 7 years ago
I believe so.
in East
Maybe
Oakland?
10 years.
Maybe
And
even
so I
this
didn't
one.
understand the connection between the officers being shot and asking the question if they were on probation or parole.
Okay, so when officers make stops,
Right,
they either communicate, they have the opportunity to communicate whatever it is, whatever the reason is, right? And in other situations, it could end up, even before they utter any words to these drivers, that they get shot right off the bat. They don't have the opportunity for the exchange.
mm-hmm,
So I think not that asking that question would beat the person, pulling out a weapon and shooting them, but I think that was sort of maybe a purposeful thing to sort of feel out a situation, like assess, you can assess a situation. That's usually what people do to, keep themselves safe. They evaluate the situation in
But
any.
then they should evaluate it on you.
Exactly.
You,
Oh yeah,
you.
thank you
But
for
that's-
reminding me,
Yeah,
thank you.
because
So the
you're
concern
just
here-
talking about one issue,
Yeah.
a certain segment, and
Right.
and I find that insulting,
Okay,
and I
but
don't
you're not-
like it.
So
Okay,
the-
I
Okay, so
understand that,
include-
and I'm not
Well,
African American, I don't
No,
understand.
you're not.
The
You
concern-
said walk
We're on
or
public.
speak.
Yeah, actually, we're not supposed to
Comment.
That's
engage
right.
to this
Can
extent. But the concern is with
I was just trying to
discriminatory
clarify
stuff.
what you
Yeah,
said.
that's all we're trying to
The
do.
concern is
Can I-
discriminatory stuff.
Yes,
Right.
discriminatory, and you should do it for all.
So
Or
I
don't
did
do it.
actually have an experience where I was in a different city and I was looking for my pet. And I was looking for my pet that was lost like 24/7 because, to me that's a family member. And I was, followed and I was stopped and that was scary and I am white. So, I felt it, but at the same time, not maybe the same thing, but at the same time, I was like, well, it's late, and I was probably suspicious, lurking around, looking for my pet. So I'm not saying that discrimination doesn't happen, and I'm not saying, that I don't think that your thoughts are not valid. What I'm saying is, on the alternative perspective, if there is one, that I'm concerned about that particular situation.
I
And so,
understand.
yeah, if you don't.
Yeah, I understand now. I didn't understand before. So
Okay,
thank you.
thank you very much
Thank you.
for the opportunity.
Thank you, I think our meeting is adjourned and we'll see each
Okay.
other in a week's time.
No
See you in a
peeking.
while,
We
Thank
have our
you.
assignments.
like Wednesday.
Yes.